Earlier in the talk, you asked Dr. Green about what issues keep him up at night. And aside from nuclear proliferation, I was wondering if you could share with us your answer for the same.
Well, largely it is kind of the meta issue of our reliable failure to make sense to one another and have conversations that productively, that lead to the solution of problems in any kind of direct way. So the fact that we have political systems that can't function over a long time horizon, we've got this 4-year election cycle presidentially to worry about, and therefore it's impossible to have a 40-year plan about anything, right? And we have problems whose time horizon is long or longish, and we have problems that are global in nature. So by definition, we can't solve these individually as nation states, and we can't solve these by fixating on the incentives of a 4-year election cycle. And in the midst of all that, we have a level of polarization, whether it's political or it's ideological across the board. Whether it's religious. There are many things that contaminate our conversation with one another, which make it virtually impossible to make sense long enough and productively enough to get all of us to converge on. Even to recognize what the problems are, much less how to solve them. So I just think that conversation is all we have. Successful conversation is all we have to solve our problems together. And so when I see it just break down, not only frequently and catastrophically, but reliably so. It's like you can just guarantee that the conversation is going to be ineffectual, given where most people are most of the time. That's what worries me, and that's kind of the meta problem that subsumes all the others, whether it's climate change or nuclear war, proliferation, or how do we deal with emerging pandemics or the prospect thereof. Why can't we decide to make more antibiotics when we know we're running out of them? We just can't agree how to create systems that incentivize things we know we want to do or should know we want to do, because we can't even talk coherently enough about these things. So
thank you.
Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
So Sam's opening question for Dr. Green was, what is it that gives you optimism about that one can make progress, I guess, intellectually? And your answer was that we can prove the outcomes, or we can predict the outcomes of experiments. The most recent question, you actually said if that's all we're doing, you'd rather find something else to do. And during your talk, you said that the quantum measurement problem is the gaping hole in the the theory of quantum theories, or theory of quantum mechanics, and makes it almost impossible to choose between those that emerge. And so it seems that there's no path to a place where the thing that gives you confidence that we can make progress, no path exists to that state. Do you retain confidence in the endeavor?
I've never quite thought of it that way, and I'm kind of devastated. So a few things. First off, when I talk about what gives me confidence in the approach that we're following, it's the fact that we have a powerful diagnostic that tells us whether we're going in the right direction. That diagnostic is not the final reason we do what we do, but that diagnostic is, can you make a prediction? Can you test it with an observation or an experiment? And I love it as a diagnostic. I don't love it as the end game. And that's the difference between the two. Now, in terms of the quantum measurement problem itself, it's a very curious state of affairs, because we have an algorithm called a quantum algorithm that allows us to make predictions for the result of an experiment even though the intermediate step, we don't understand how the universe makes that intermediate step, and that's the hole that I was describing earlier. But nevertheless, the algorithm works, and that's borne out by the agreement between prediction and observation. So it's not as though we're fully at sea and the boat's about to tip. We are incredibly on course, but there are vital pieces of the story that we've yet to figure out. Now, I should say, there are other physicists who would be up here and saying there is no quantum measurement problem. I mean, my good friend, Anton Zeilinger, this is a brilliant man who doesn't just do quantum physics calculations, he actually does the experiments. So this is like the real deal, not like someone just spouts off about these ideas. He actually does the stuff. And when I sit with him and talk with him, he kind of has an avuncular attitude toward me. He says, hey, you can worry about those kind of things if you want to, but you're wasting your time because there's no problem, Brian. And so that's his perspective. It works. We have an algorithm, and we can make predictions, and end of story. So it's just to say that there are different attitudes as to whether this is an issue, because I think there are different goals that we have as scientists. As we were saying to the earlier question, some of us just want to be able to predict, some of us want to be able to enlighten. And whether that latter goal is misguided, I don't know. I don't think it is, but some in the field certainly do.
Thanks.
Hello, my name's Brendan. I'm an intern on some of the dark matter experiments at Snow Lab, and I have a question for Brian. I was curious, seeing the results from many recent dark matter experiments that have searched larger energy spaces and are possibly indicating it may not exist, and that brings into question some of the predictions of supersymmetry. So I was wondering, what do you think the plan B is if that doesn't work out?
Well, just 30 seconds on the background, and everybody I think knows that since the 1930s there's been increasing evidence that there should be more stuff out there than we see, dark stuff, because we need something to give rise to an additional gravitational tug responsible for the motions of stars and galaxies that we observe. So for a long time now we've been trying to go out and find this dark stuff. We assume that it's raining down on Earth. We don't see it, but we build detectors in hopes that we will.
Can you spell out what dark means in this context?
Dark solely means that it doesn't give off light.
Right.
And that's really all that it is. So it's many of the proposals involve particles that, as the questioner asked, some of them are exotic species of particles that come out of theories like string theory or more generally supersymmetry. And we had hoped, and the hope is not dead, that these experiments would capture one of these dark particles that don't give off light, that don't interact with the electromagnetic force. That's
right.
A more precise way of saying it. But we've come up empty-handed for a long time. So what's the answer to this? There are a number of answers. Number one, it could be that we just got to keep on looking and we'll find it. I think that's the bread and butter answer that many people still have. More exotic answer is that perhaps there is no dark matter at all, and maybe it's our understanding of the force of gravity that needs to be modified. And that's why things are moving in a way that doesn't comport with our previous understanding of gravity, and that motivated the introduction of this new stuff to make up the difference, but maybe it's gravity that's not doing what we think it should be doing. And a third possibility, which is an elaboration of that, is there are exotic ideas that have emerged from string theory, so-called holographic ideas. It'd be a bit involved to explain it in any detail, but some of those ideas suggest that there's no need for dark matter at all, that the natural solution to the mismatch between observation and prediction is resolved in these more exotic approaches to understanding the force of gravity. So those are 2.5, roughly 3 possible plan Bs.
Thank you very much.
Hi there, I'm Vlad, and this question is for Sam, but I'd love to hear Brian's thoughts as well. Sam, you see our efforts to make moral progress as us navigating a landscape of possible states of consciousness, and the way to navigate that space is through science. I would generally agree with this, but I think that there are certain categories of navigation problems to which science cannot provide an objective answer due to the fact that there are many types of beneficial mental states that are qualitatively different from each other and not readily comparable. So, for example, loving another person, or the joy of working to create something, or mindfulness, helping others, etc.
Right.
And it may be the case that achieving a peak in one area, let's say intense meditation or mindfulness, may necessitate suffering in another area, let's say the love that comes from close personal relationships. So my question is, how can we ever determine which is more important? How can science help us navigate when realizing one beneficial conscious state is in conflict with realizing another beneficial but qualitatively different conscious state?
And you want me to weigh in on this too?
Yeah, that'd be great.
You can say as much as I said about dark matter. So there's a couple of intuitions there that I would just want to push on. One is the idea that not being able to answer those questions is a problem for the claim that there is an answer to those questions. So this is, in my book, The Moral Landscape, I differentiated answers in practice from answers in principle. We know there are many facts of the matter for which there are answers in principle, and trivially easy answers in principle, just integer-based answers. Like how many grains of sand are there on Earth, right? As long as we define grain of sand clearly enough, that is an integer answer. And yet we know we'll never have access to that information, and it probably just changed anyway, right? So, or even simpler, how many, the example I've often used is, how many birds are in flight over the surface of the Earth at this moment, right? Well, it just changed, and we know we're never going to get the data. So, but there was an answer to that question. There are other kinds of questions where there are no clear answers, but there are ranges of answers. There's kind of a blurry, haze around the right answer, and some of these are just norms of just how we run society. It's like, well, what's the right age to give someone a driver's license? Well, when I was 15 and a half, I thought 16 was probably a little too late. Now when I drive and I look over and I see a 16-year-old behind the wheel of a 4,000-pound automobile, I think that looks insane to me, right? So self-driving cars can't come soon enough. But what's the right answer? Well, given all things considered, and it's an all things considered situation where we know we can never do this perfectly. We know that some 16-year-olds are really not up to it, but we have to draw the line somewhere. Wherever we draw the line, it's going to be arbitrary. 16 is arbitrary, 16 and a half is arbitrary, 18 would be arbitrary. And yet we know there are wrong answers. We know that 6 months is definitely the wrong answer, right? So if you shift the window of consideration there, you're not capturing anything we care about. If you move it to 16, well, if we moved it to 25, fewer people would die. There's no question, right? But we have other concerns beyond body count. We have, mothers and fathers who are just sick of driving their kids to school every day, right? So what's that worth? And we play around with this, and we know we're never going to do the math sufficiently so that we know down to our toes that we've got it perfectly right? But it doesn't mean that there aren't better and worse answers in that space. We know there are worse answers. 6 months just gets you absolutely nowhere, and 100 also doesn't work, right? So the answer is somewhere along this continuum, and for many things in life, we have to be satisfied with that. Now, I think we will be less and less satisfied the more we can get our hands on really good data, and the more our technology allows us to use that data in ways. And I think this will be surprising. So this is true in medicine in many ways. It's like when there's nothing to do about a condition, right? There is no cure. There's no understanding of its basic biology, and yet people are suffering mightily. It's like polio, right? People it used to be a common feature of life, even in the most affluent areas, that people would be hobbled and killed by polio, right? Now we've lost sight of that horror because we have a vaccine for polio, and have had it, for as long as most of us have been alive. Now, preventing polio is a trivially easy thing to do, and if you decided, the people who are against vaccines across the board, or so worried about the possibility that they have some other downside, or who are kind of preventing their kids from getting vaccinated, in a very local area, it may not cause a problem for them or the people around them, but if enough people do it, we'll be back to the days of polio, right? And that is clearly no place worth going, right? And it becomes, you move from an environment in which you have this devastating thing for which there's nothing to do, and you just got to sort of pray it doesn't happen to you, to it's a trivially easy solve, and you're irresponsible if you don't do it, right? And those, we will continually be buffeted around by those kinds of changes based on knowledge and changes in technology. But my main resistance to the question is the idea that a lack of answers in practice means that there are no answers in principle, and that a blurry boundary around the right answer means that the difference between better and worse, and even much, much better and much, much worse, goes out the window. I think we still have that, no matter how dimly we understand our situation on any of these things. So, yeah, I hope that made sense.
I mean, let me just
Yeah, go for it.
again, the only thought that occurs to me, and I may not be fully appreciating the nuance of the question, so apologies. But one of the things that we certainly teach to our students, standard physics issue with students is it's critical to pose a well-formed question. And a well-formed research question is one that's not overdetermined, not underdetermined, but it's one that has an answer. And that's a very hard step to get to properly frame a question so that there is a procedure by which an answer can emerge, because the system is not underdetermined, it's not overdetermined, it's not self-contradictory, and there is a unique answer to be found. And the issues that you're describing are ones that typically are underdetermined. So I'm a little bit confused when you say, the answer is somewhere between here and here. What do you mean by the answer?
Well,
it's an underdetermined question.
In this case, what should be the driving age?
No, I understand
Right.
the question,
Yeah.
but it's an underdetermined question. There is no right answer to it based on it's not a well-posed question. I mean, you can make decisions, like you say, and various people will come up with different propositions for what the good policy should be, but there is no the answer in the sense that there is an electron magnetic moment, right? There is a the answer in that situation, because it's a question that's posed in a specific way.
But there is a gradient.
A gradient.
And if you go far enough in one direction,
Absolutely.
you can feel yourself getting colder.
Totally got that.
And then you go back warmer.
Totally got it.
So,
But that doesn't mean that there is a the answer.
Yeah, no. So in those cases, any answer within a certain boundary may just seem arbitrary, because it will be arbitrary. You can't specify the right answer.
I agreed.
Yeah. Okay. But
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I was wondering if I could get both of your thoughts on the role of the social stigma, the societal stigma against being wrong, the role that plays in political, philosophical, and even scientific discourse, and assuming that role is negative and substantial, what can we do on both a personal and societal level to mitigate and combat that stigma?
yeah, good question. I would add to that, and I'll pitch it to you first. There's a stigma around saying you don't know something, and there's a asymmetry here. So in science, there's very little stigma around this. In fact, scientists defensively say they don't know all the time, so as not to embarrass themselves in front of people who know more than they do at a conference. So, but if you put a scientist on television, and get him or her talking about global warming or whatever it is, and they start issuing the responsible scientific caveats about, well, we're not, I'm not an expert on this, or I don't know that.
Yeah.
That doesn't translate well into, popular the journalistic consumption of information. And if you put that person up against some Bible-thumping blowhard who knows everything, they lose. So
Totally get it.
Yeah.
And that's why there is not a single video of me, and I say this with 100% confidence, because I have never been on television talking about something that I did not feel expert in.
Right.
I'm not interested. I get all sorts of calls to talk about things like the climate and features of that sort, and I don't do it. Why? For exactly the reason that you're saying. I am comfortable saying I don't know, but that's not the place to be saying it.
Right.
So to your question, it is the case, as Sam is saying, that we recognize, certainly as theoretical physicists, that most of what we do in our life will be wrong. Not because we made a mistake. Sometimes we will make a mistake. That's the hard time when that happens. But it'll be wrong in the sense that it will be irrelevant. Nature won't take any interest in the direction that our research took us, so whatever we published will just rot away in some journal someplace. And that's true for the vast majority of what we will do. And to be a theoretical physicist, to come to terms with that early on. And so we're very comfortable with being wrong in that sense. And I think that's a very valuable lesson. And it is a good one to have. And it does allow us freedom. Because we're not constantly worried, well, if I go that direction, I'll be wrong. No, we just go. And that allows us to have unexpected eureka moments that change everything. But that's, as a community, the individual will go down many blind alleys, and that's just how it is.
Well, how do you experience this larger phenomenon, which is related, of people having a kind of confirmation bias and a sunk cost bias that keeps them wedded to a theory that is almost certainly wrong, or for which there's good evidence to believe that they wouldn't come to it that way now, and it absorbs decades or at least years of their time.
I've never seen that happen.
Right. So, but what's often celebrated in science is that happens less in science than anywhere else. Like in science, you win points even for proving yourself wrong, or for disavowing the thing that made you famous last decade, because there's now new data.
Well, hopefully you're the one that finds the problem with it.
Yeah.
But I think we have confidence that we're part of a community that's incredibly skeptical, that's always investigating itself. Any idea that's put forward, the rest of the community takes a sledgehammer and starts to smash on it, trying to break it. And so we feel confident that if it doesn't break, it's worthy. It's worthy of further attention and further study. So from that perspective, it's so rare for an idea to sort of hang out there and the community says it's okay and tries to smash it, they can't smash it, and it's completely irrelevant, completely wrong, we've all been deluded. It's such a rare phenomenon. So I believe it's really the fact that we're part of this community that's self-policing. It doesn't need something from the outside to come in and pass judgment. It's an internal self-correcting mechanism that allows it to make progress.
Yeah.
My name's Mike. Hi, Brian and Sam. I'm very appreciative that you guys are here and very thankful that we had such a privilege to hear you talk about such high-level topics.
Well, thanks for coming.
I have a question that pertains in part to both of you, and you'll each have your own area of expertise to maybe give some input on it. You didn't really get to talking about different interpretations of, like, for example, the many worlds theory that you talked about. I know that, Brian, you talk a lot about brain theory and that, spatially distributed universes where there could be copies of us, potentially. So the part for you would be, which is the horse you're betting on in terms of if we were to ever be able to maybe prove that, whether it's the many worlds interpretation or through brain theory, that we could indeed prove that there are copies of ourselves or multiple universes, and one day prove this fact. And then if we could, to Sam, would that be enough fodder to, write QED on the blackboard and say that all religious dogma kind of goes out the window, since we would have infinite Jesus Christ and infinite, deities in each of these universes, and there can only be one true one according to the dogma. So would that maybe be enough that you could just slam it on the table and walk out?
Unfortunately, in some of those universes, there are, well, this brings us to the other thing we didn't talk about, the simulation argument, the idea that we might be living in a simulation. And the concern there is that we could be living in a simulation run by, the Mormons of the future, where Mormonism is true in this simulation. And there's a similar problem in the many worlds interpretation, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but if absolutely everything compatible with the laws of physics happens in these universes, isn't there some construal of quantum mechanics where Jesus is physically resurrected and that's not incompatible with? There's some quantum spookiness that allows for things like a physical resurrection.
Yeah,
right?
you don't even need to go to quantum mechanics in that incarnation, in that version.
Everybody get ready with Twitter, because what's about to come out is going to be good.
Yeah. So one of the puzzles of modern cosmology is that if we allow inflationary cosmology, which is the bread and butter version of the theory that people are talking about, if that's the right way of thinking about the universe, then ours would just be one of many universes, be many big bangs in many realms out there. And what that entails, in principle, is that if we wait long enough in a given universe, random particle motion, just random particle motion in a given universe, will coalesce into any physically realizable structure.
Right.
So
you can just get Jesus appearing, or Jesus or Kim Kardashian just appearing out of the
That's exactly
ether.
right. And I'm not joking about that. So we call it the Boltzmann brain problem after Ludwig Boltzmann, who died this day in 1906. And he was the first person to really think about the fact that our universe itself may not have originated from some process in the distant past, but the universe may have existed effectively for an eternity, and just the random particle motion at one weird moment happened to coalesce into a configuration that over time then evolved into everything that we are familiar with. And that is a rare fluctuation of the particles, but his point was, if you've got an eternity, rare things will happen.
And not only will happen, every rare thing is
That's
guaranteed
right.
to happen.
So then we take that one step further beyond what he said, which is effectively the point that you're making, which is in the far future, if the universe exists for an infinite amount of time into the far future, which these current theories suggest, then these random particle motions, sure, they could create another Big Bang, but it's even easier for them to create something less complex. Not a whole universe, but just create a brain floating in the void.
Right.
So it could be that in the far future, the particles come together and they create a thinking brain that sort of has some thoughts. And it might think that it's here having this conversation. And that brain may just exist for a second or two and disintegrates. But if the configuration of the particles is even more special, it'll last longer and longer. And if it's even more special still, it could think it's Jesus, it could be Jesus, or it could be Kim Kardashian, it could be any of these structures.
Right.
So yes, I'd rather you not tweet about it per se, because it has some nuance associated with it. But yeah, that would be in our future in these various ways of thinking about cosmology.
Right. But also not just in the future. If space were big enough,
Good.
you just go far enough in one direction, you're going to hit all those
Absolutely.
possibilities.
So
right?
if space is infinitely big,
Right.
which we don't know that it is, but again, in the most favored version of cosmology, that's a very natural outcome, that space is infinitely big. And there's an interesting thing that happens there, which is in any region, like our observable universe, the part that we can have interactions with, we have a lot of particles here. It's a number that you made reference to, 10 to the 80, 10 to the 88, some large number of particles in our universe. Quantum mechanics shows that there are only a finite number, a huge number, but there are only a finite number of configurations of those particles. Now, if space goes on infinitely far, imagine you have chunks of universe that are as big as ours, populated by particles, and you ask yourself, can the particle configuration in each chunk be different? Well, if it goes on infinitely far, and there are only finitely many distinct configurations, there aren't enough distinct configurations to go around. The particle configurations have to repeat. And if they have to repeat, that means that there's a version of us out there, and there's a version of effectively anything compatible laws of physics out there, and not just out there once, out there infinitely many times.
I think you just made me a Scientologist.
My work is done.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks.
Hey guys, great talk, appreciate it very much. All right, so I might be a bit atypical. I'm going to ask about animal rights. I guess Brian is into animal rights a bit. So my question is, what is it that's true of an animal that, if true of a human, would justify stabbing them to death for a hamburger? And if you can name such a property, something that, if true of humans, would justify doing this to them, would you be able to spell out the situation in which we do it to them without sounding completely psychopathic? Just to give a quick example, we'll not waste time. If you were to say intelligence, would it be okay to murder low intelligence people? If you were to say that it's the fact that it's natural, would it be, okay to murder humans if that were natural, etc.?
Right.
And I'll just say, when we went to dinner earlier,
He has the moral high ground based on dinner.
The vegan had to sit with 3 meat eaters eating these like big ass steaks. All right, so toss it to you.
Well, the amazing thing is I briefly considered what to order in light of having to face this moment, and then I said, fuck it.
Wasn't worth it.
That's right, yes. No, why make it easy on myself? Well, so there are many. So I'm basically a consequentialist, which means I just think the cash value of a moral proposition is in the well-being of conscious creatures now or in the future, actual or possible, right? So I think there are things that should be captured. They can be captured by consequentialism thought all the way through that aren't normally captured by it. So, for instance, when you ask why is it, why can't we just kill, if we find people who have the characteristics of livestock, why can't we treat them exactly like livestock, right? So that's sort of a question you just asked. Well, given the nature of what we are as social primates, treating people exactly like livestock has a different consequence on us and on our culture and on our capacity to live with one another than treating livestock like livestock. So it's not precisely the same problem, right? So and that's why cannibalism. I mean, there's a taboo around cannibalism that makes sense. I guess there could be some world in which we throw off this taboo and that we don't pay the kinds of consequences many of us feel we might pay, right? So we could just eat the dead. Because they're good protein and we're not at all sentimental about their bodies once we know they're no longer have a basis for experience, right? But in this world, at this moment, given all the moving parts, if people start eating their parents when they die, we feel differently about them, right? And that begins to derange a lot of many other things we care about. So you have to take all the consequences in view. Now, I think that it's impossible to defend factory farming as it is. I mean, knowing the details. I think it's just, we want to solve that problem somehow, right? And yet, I happen to think that it's not at all obvious that we can all be vegans and be healthy, right? I mean, we were talking, to give the full picture, we were talking about the problem of being a parent and having vegan or vegetarian kids, right? Now, my view of that is that you're running a kind of science experiment on your kids, and it's not totally clear how it's going to come out, right? And when I've run that experiment on myself, it's, I became anemic the first time I was a vegetarian for 6 years. All kinds of things go sideways in my blood the last time I did this experiment for a year. Now, no doubt with more intelligence or more attention to the details, most people can solve those problems for themselves as a vegan or a vegetarian, but perhaps not everyone can, right? And I think there may be another solution. I mean, I'm hopeful that this clean meat revolution that is struggling to be born will be one solution. So there's a company, Memphis Meats, whose CEO I had on my podcast, where they have a meatball that they have engineered that does not entail the death of any animal. It entails the removal of a single cell from the right animal. They grow these cells in culture, and then you have, unfortunately now it's still an $18,000 meatball, but ultimately, if it could be brought to scale, it would be a meat industry that wouldn't entail the suffering and death of billions of animals. There's this, if you really are worried just about the experience of conscious creatures, there is a way of flipping this around. I have no illusions that this will convince you, a committed vegan or vegetarian, but you have to have an actual counter-argument if you stipulate what I want you to stipulate here. If it's possible to raise livestock under conditions where they're really living lives worth living, right? So that you can really have happy cows or happy ducks or chickens or pigs, which is to say, it would be better for those animals to have been than to not have been. These are net positive lives. Well, then that's a world in which veganism is not actually the most compassionate solution. That would be a world in which bringing those billions of creatures into existence and giving them net positive lives would be better than not, if you think well-being aggregates in some way. If you have the intuition that having a world with 7 billion happy people is better than a world with 2 billion happy people, stipulating that happiness accrues in some sense, right? You can run that same experiment. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near there with respect to our current practices, and I would completely support every differentiation one wanted to make with respect to the ethics of treating animals well. But it's not given all of the moving parts, it's not a straightforward question of saying, well, obviously everyone should be vegan right now.
Well, I would just answer by saying, don't stab them for the hamburger.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
Yes, that is one answer, but I think it's
Yeah, thanks to you both for coming. Sam, big fan on the podcast. My question is for you, actually, and it has to do with AI. And when I think about your podcast, you talk to so many very intelligent, intellectual people on a number of different topics. And I'm interested to know what you are most excited about. You talked about, the pessimism, related to human intelligence and what we are all aware of. And obviously AI is going to, really take us to the next level, be it from, the CRISPR perspective of, looking at all of the different research that's being done here at home or outwardly at, planetary exploration. But from a standpoint, just for all of us in the room, what are you most excited about in, the remaining years that you're here on Earth when you think about AI and the advancements and the potential that we have? What are you most excited about?
Well, I think it's the most important and amazing and necessary thing when you think about it going well, right? Like we have all of these problems for which intelligence across some threshold is the only solution, right? Whether it's, how to solve for certain diseases, or stabilize our economy, or understand climate well enough, or make various scientific breakthroughs that would give us great benefit. And to think of building systems that can play all of these games that we care about and are right to care about, and which protect everything else we care about, so much better than we can, that it's clear they need to do it. I mean, just when you look at what's happened with a very simple game like chess or Go, AlphaZero. So we've been playing chess for, I don't know, what was it, something like 1,000 years, right? And you have the totality of human knowledge and ingenuity purposed on that very narrow task where people have gotten just amazingly good at this, and people spend their whole lives getting, we have the smartest people spending their whole lives at this fairly simple task and getting as good as humanly possible. And then we build computer programs that have studied every game we have a record of, and they get as good as it seems they can possibly get on the basis of the totality of that knowledge, and they get a little bit better than people. And that's the situation that we had up until Google came up with AlphaGo and then AlphaZero. And AlphaZero was a program that didn't have any chess knowledge in it, right? Didn't study all of humanity's record of genius with chess. It just played itself for 4 hours and then beat the best bespoke chess computer ever made, right? Or played it something like 100 games and to a draw 28 times and then beat it 72 other times. So you just imagine having that kind of breakthrough in every other area that we care about, whether it's solving mathematical theorems or protein folding problems and developing new drugs, everything, right? Intelligence is the only game in town when you want to solve problems, and there's no reason to think that it's not substrate independent, which is to say there's no reason to think that all the intelligence we care about, that there's every reason to think that intelligence across the board is just like chess, right? It's just like that. We now know that computers can be much better than we will ever be at chess or at Go. And there's every reason to think that everything else we're doing on the basis of information processing is just like that. I think that's an assumption, but I think it's a good assumption to make. And once you make that assumption, then you just see all of the ways in which we can solve problems we can't even dream of solving now. And that will be an amazing world to live in. It's also very interesting that if we get any significant piece of that wrong, we are just ushering in this just dystopian hellscape for ourselves, very likely, right? And there are all kinds of moral problems we need to solve because we need to build our values into these intelligent systems. We can't have, they have to be tethered to what we want and our own notion of our own well-being, and they have to be something that we can be in dialogue with, so as to refine our notion of what we want and what we should want in the future. I mean, that's the ultimate thing for me would be to have an intelligent system that would be a kind of oracle or a kind of genie, where you could be in dialogue with it and it could sort of map out for you sort of where you are in this part of the landscape of possible experience, and where it is you might find worth going based on what's possible for a brain like yours, and a brain like yours in perhaps very real mechanical dialoog or electromagnetic dialogue or pharmacological dialogue with a system more intelligent than yourself. So I think the life could get very, very strange and very, very wonderful. But again, there's like this tightrope walk into the strange and wonderful, and off the rope is just this plunge into weirdness, and that's not at all humanistic or even compatible with our basic sanity. So I think it's thrilling because it's a problem where science and moral philosophy totally intersect, right? Like, this is philosophy on a deadline, as somebody recently said. That might have been Nick Bostrom. And I think there's a lot of problems we have to get right, and even to think about this stuff. And it relates to the question that was just asked about the ethics of killing animals. I mean, we could live to see a time where there's just as poignant an ethical question about you turning off your computer. Are you committing a murder when you turn off a computer of sufficient sophistication, right? Or are we inadvertently building machines that can suffer, and that's a huge problem. So.
Hello, Sam. My question relates to your claim about our lack of free will. Given such postulate is true, how do we draw the line between the incompatible nature of free will with reality as we understand it versus our lack of free will and its irreconcilable nature with a functioning pragmatism? In other words, if the most evil man we can envision is simply a Darwinistic and/or environmental error who happened to inherit a concoction of variances which he did not choose, how do we finally calibrate our moral scruples on an obvious contradiction between well-being and responsibility? As an example, if we were to create a pill that could cure the next kid who would potentially be Charles Whitman, it seems a net positive for everyone in doing so. However, if we try to run the same logic with Hitler and Saddam Hussein post-atrocities, our moral edifice seems to fall right under our feet. Granted, such situations are anomalous, but I would argue the same logic can be applied at a lesser degree on most criminals. So I have two questions for you. Number one, could it be that...
I love this. What's amazing here is what you're doing now, people really often hate, but you're doing it so well that it's just fun. So just keep doing it. So ask your question.
I'm very nervous right now, which is why I'm trying to speak so fast.
No, it's great. Okay.
Number one, could it be that the pragmatic implications of a nonchalant happiest can be Hitler roaming around, jeopardize society, and therein overturn his lack of responsibility for having done so in the first place? And number two, where do you draw the boundary between our ethical commitment to curing the ill and the devastating repercussions their misapprehensions can cause on society?
Right. Okay. Well, that's a great question about the implications of dispensing with free will on our morality and on our politics and on our solving problems together. Well, so I don't know where, we haven't talked about this, but I don't know if free will makes as little sense to you as it does to me. I think free will is I think there's no way to think about the propagation of causes in this world that makes any deep sense of this notion of free will. And I think if we understood ourselves, if you grant that nobody picks their parents, nobody picks their genes, nobody picks the environmental influences to the system that's specified by genes and development.
Yeah, we're each a bag of particles governed by the laws of physics, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, and even if you added, ectoplasm or immortal souls, nobody picks their souls, or soul.
Or even put quantum mechanics, the randomness of quantum mechanics is not what we mean by volitional choice.
Exactly, right. So we're sort of on the same page, it sounds like. So,
But we had to say that.
Yeah. And if you returned our brains to precisely the state they're in at this moment, we would make the noises that we're making in precisely the same way every time. Well, but adding randomness,
I do not agree with
randomness
that.
doesn't help.
Randomness doesn't help, but we wouldn't make the same noises. We would make different noises, but we couldn't choose what noises we would make, and that's very different.
Those noises would be dictated by the totality of influences to the system in that moment. Are you adding quantumness, or are you adding...
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so this whole idea of rerunning the tape and running it forward again does not yield the same progression, but it doesn't yield the progression that we have volitional choice of.
Right, got it, okay. So quantum mechanics
doesn't... make that clear.
Yeah, quantum mechanics doesn't get you the freedom you think you have either.
Exactly.
But you add this additional piece where we have these cases where someone does something heinous, like there was a case that I talked about with Robert Sapolsky on my podcast that it was in the news where some otherwise totally normal guy started getting really fixated on child pornography, right? So there was child pornography was found on his work computer or whatever. He got fired. And then he started doing all kinds of inappropriate things, and they discovered he had a brain tumor, and the judge in this case didn't find the brain tumor totally exculpatory for somebody. Like the judge sort of split the baby and put him in jail for 8 years when it could have been, for the rest of his life. And Robert and I both talked about what a bizarre miscarriage of justice that was, but it is an intuition that we all have that once you understand the causes of bad behavior clearly enough, once you find a brain tumor that's big enough and in just the right place, as was the case with Charles Whitman, who you referenced, that seems exculpatory. That seems like, okay, this person's just suffering bad luck. He's got a bad roll of the dice biologically. He's not the really evil person who deserves to be punished. My argument is that if you understood all of the causal connections that dictate our behavior, you would arrive at that same epiphany with respect to every evil thing that every person does. And what's more, if we had a cure for those causes, right? If there was a cure, I mean, right now there's no cure for psychopathy. We just have people who are psychopaths, evil people who are reliably doing terrible things because they're selfish and they don't feel the kind of empathy that most of us feel for the suffering of others. Well, then if we had something we could put in the water so as to just knock psychopathy just out of the theater of human events, we would do that, and we would then view psychopathy as a condition like diabetes, right? There's not much praise or blame associated with having it. It's just bad luck, right? Now, your concern is that I think that we need, we're in this sort of no man's land where we don't totally understand the basis of human behavior, and what's more, we don't have remedies for people being bad.
My thing is, I understand your case with Charles Whitman and say maybe
right.
13.
But with Hitler, it's hard, exactly. Right? And I mean, I would grant you that there are, on some level, we do just want to do what works, right? I mean, and there's so like the question is the question of whether to punish bad people isn't a question about free will. It's not saying they could do otherwise. The question is, and then therefore it's not a question of them really deserving to be punished once you catch them, because they really are bad. The question is, what are the effects of punishment? And in many cases, the effects are what we want them to be, right? Punishment, certain kinds of punishments reliably dissuade people from doing bad things when they're dissuadable. Now, some people are not dissuadable, right? And some punishments are so out of register with the thing we're trying to prevent that they derange something else about our society. I mean, if we can't make, if it was a matter of capital punishment for, cutting into line at the bank, right? Well, then, no one would ever cut into line, but, we would live in a horrific society, right? And there's some societies that kind of approximate that. I mean, so, there are authoritarian societies like Singapore where they seem to cane you or kill you for just about anything, right? And it's very orderly, right? And so, like, there are people who will talk about the upside of killing people for marijuana possession because it works so damn well in Singapore. Now, I don't think they have it, the dial tuned to quite the right spot there, but again, it comes down to what sort of world you want to live in, and I think, but I think this conversation is only going to be going in one direction. It's not like we're going to learn less and less about ourselves, right? And the more and more we learn about ourselves, it's going to fill in the blank spaces on the map in a reliable way, and it'll be in a way that makes things look like there's no deep agency, there's no deep responsibility, and there's no bright line between when someone becomes the victim of circumstance. The example I often use is, Saddam Hussein, when he's 40 years old, is a scary bastard who just deserves to be hung, right? Because he's made enough people suffer. He has this coming to him. But you roll back the clock in his life, well, he's 18, well, he's still pretty scary and, probably deserves to be hung, right? But when he's 4, he is just the unlucky boy who has bad genes and bad parents and a bad society, who is destined to become Saddam Hussein on some level, right? And the more we learn about ourselves is going to make the kind of the timeline look more and more like the boy's timeline, right, and less like the scary man's timeline. That's what I would argue, but that I guess remains to be
Brian
seen.
And Sam, we got a minute to finish up here. If you guys have any final thoughts for the evening.
Okay, so sorry, we just got to the end of the voice of God tells us that we're time is real. Do you have any closing point that you want to make?
No, I'm good.
Good. Awesome.
All right, everyone, please give a big round of applause to Brian Greene and Sam Harris.
Thank you so much.